Chapter 24, Act 24, Rose's Tale. Act 24, Rose's Tale, The Nightmare Oath.
Whoa! What is going on here?
Theodore gasped, spinning around as an outpour of delicious smells and explosions of color and light rushed past him. It was a gang of children, waving sparklers and wearing wreaths of desert blooms, all saturated in some of the most vivid colors he had ever seen. The hooded man paused, crossing his arms.
Must be some sort of festival. The streets are lined with every type of food vendor you can imagine. And there's music!
Theodore exclaimed, pointing toward a small stage that had been constructed in the northwestern square. It was currently populated with a fair-haired, slender minstrel strumming a lute and caterwauling into the oncoming twilight, throngs of young women and girls squealing and throwing their flower wreaths on the stage. The prince had to do a double take. For a moment, he thought King Edward had descended from Damsion Castle to regale his fans, of which he still had many even to this day. He caught the hooded man watching the minstrel with a look of intense confusion that made him nearly double over in laughter. For the first time since they had met, he didn't have a look of deadly seriousness carved in his features, and it didn't suit him at all.
Is that the kind of music people are into these days?
The hooded man blinked, and Theodore giggled behind his hand.
I know you said you became a survivalist after the war, but have you been living under a rock the entire time too?
The hooded man turned to Theodore, a stormy glare preceding him.
Let's not get into who was doing what with their lives these past few years, little prince. I'm going to chalk that up to you being delirious with exhaustion. Desert travel is far more fatiguing than you think. Let's see if there's room for us at the inn, first, and then if you are lucky, I'll give you some money to buy us food.
Geez, Theodore pouted.
You would really starve me after putting me through hell on that cliff? How do you think you're going to take on the fake Red Wings without me? Your confidence is noted, but also sorely overreaching.
The hooded man raised an eyebrow. They crossed the spectator-filled lanes to the Capo Inn, which appeared to be bursting at the seams. All of the windows on the second level were thrown open, with people cheering drunkenly and hanging out the windows with their mugs and goblets as they waved to passers-by. Theodore raised his hand to wave back, but the hooded man knocked it away.
Discretion, Your Highness. Right?
Theodore sighed. He was brimming with a perplexing mix of anxiety and eagerness. He wanted so badly to forget everything that had happened the past few days, even just for a few minutes, and disappear into the crowds. In Capo, he was no one of importance, just a 15-year-old boy on a summer adventure, not the deposed, possibly orphaned prince from the most powerful nation in the world. At the same time, the conspiracy he had been absorbed into was deepening by the minute. So much had happened, yet he wasn't any closer to the answers he needed, even as much as he wanted to race forward. The hooded man pushed his way to the front desk past the threshold, and Theodore remained a few feet behind, suddenly very cognizant of not trying to look suspicious after the hooded man's scolding. But no one seemed to notice him. Either everyone dashing about was too drunk, or he was too much of a mess to be recognized in the first place.
We have one bed left,
he overheard the innkeeper say apologetically.
You picked the busiest night imaginable to visit Capo. It's the annual flower festival. It's fine,
the hooded man shrugged.
My son can have the bed, I'll just sleep on the floor. It will be cold. A lot of folks don't realize the desert gets real cold, real fast, overnight. I'll manage.
Theodore looked away, gripping his arm. He knew the hooded man was just trying to keep their identities under wraps, but hearing the stranger call him son had made his heart twist tortuously. All I wanted was to be on my own. I was so tired of being known only as the heir to the Holy Paladin. Now I would do anything to see him again and tell him I am sorry for my insolence. Father told me when he was in Capo, he had just been separated from Cain and had left everything he had known in Baron behind. Did he spend the night here drowned in as much heartache as I? Maybe I really am destined to follow his path. Which means it still has yet to get so much darker before I'm embraced by the light. How can I possibly survive when I've not even a fraction of his strength, and no friends to call my own?
Theodore. Hey.
Theodore looked up, where the hooded man was staring at him, his hand extended with a small amount of gil.
You wanted to see the festival, right?
Theodore flushed, shaking his head. Had it been that obvious before? He really was nothing but a petulant child, knight's emblem or none.
No, I. How can I possibly when we need to? We need to get something in our stomachs,
the hooded man said firmly, taking Theodore's hand and dumping the gill within before forcing his fingers closed over the coins.
Then, we can devise our plan. Find whatever looks best and come back here right away, all right?
Yes sir, Theodore nodded, and retreated from the inn. He could feel the hooded man's stare on his back until he was swallowed into the swell of the crowds. Looking around, he became once more utterly entranced by all the activity around him. Vendors were shouting at revelers to try samples, someone at a booth was swallowing fire to raucous applause, and a new group of musicians had taken the stage, belting out a bard song about Princess Ursula of Fable that King Edward had composed at the time of her birth. It made Theodore's face light on fire just hearing it. All he could think about was the last time he had seen her, when she had planted her foot squarely in his face and nearly broke his nose on his birthday. I wonder what she's doing right now. Probably beating one of her father's poor students into submission and totally oblivious to the threat heading for her doorstep. He bit his lip, clenching the gill tighter. Ursula. Be careful. His appetite suddenly fading into oblivion, Theodore crossed the lane and purchased dinner at the only stand that didn't have a line 5 people deep. As he completed the transaction, a parade of maidens tossing flower petals began to dance down the street, completely blocking the way back to the inn, while the children in the crowds rushed to swarm them and catch the petals. Sighing in resignation, Theodore turned to go in the opposite direction, deciding to loop around in a circle to make his return. As he crossed the northern oasis, which was considerably quieter and much less densely populated, he passed 2 gravestones nestled in a desert garden, one of them with a very familiar name. Tella. So, this is where you and your daughter were put to rest. It's really beautiful, just like my parents said. Theodore slowed his stride, ignoring the insistent burn of the food in his hands as he turned into the garden and paused to pay his respects. My father has told me so many stories about you. Most notably how you saved his and my mother's lives on countless occasions. It's odd to feel joyous at a graveside, but I feel so happy to have finally met you after all this time. If you hadn't given up your life to cast the ultimate black magic, Golbez would have surely killed my mother that terrible day in the Tower of Zot, and I wouldn't be here. I thank you with all of my heart. For everything. He stood silently for 5 minutes, wondering if there was really anything he could ever say that was worthy of what Tella had done for him, what he had done for the world, wondering too what his father might have thought the first time he visited Tella's grave. Theodore had never known what it was like to have someone who was in your life just unexpectedly disappear, at least, not until the day of the airship crash, and he suddenly realized how incredibly lucky he had been his first 15 years of life. I used to think Father was the Blessed One. But to have so many people you cared for vanish from your life? That's not really lucky at all, is it?
You knew these people?
Theodore flinched at the sound of the hooded man's voice over his shoulder. He hadn't realized his eyes were watering until he felt a tear break the dam and slide down his cheek.
This is Sage Tella. And his daughter, too.
He nodded toward the second grave, carved with Anna's name.
He fought alongside my father in the old war.
He was met with silence. Theodore turned, reaching up to rub away the tear with his wrist as the steam from the food rose into the air, obscuring his view of the hooded man's darkened eyes.
What about you? Did you know about them?
He pressed his lips together, turning away.
I was worried about you. Let's go back.
The Red Wings. Kane had retreated to the berth of the ship, slinging orders at the soldiers on his way down to take them back to Baron for the night. Had there not been injuries to attend to, he would have simply finished out the night by storming Dam Sion and plucking the crystal of fire from beneath Edward's nose while he slept, but the residents of Fable had put up more of a fight than he had anticipated and put a pin in that for the time being. The king's spawn had been a wild card he had not been expecting. She was quite possibly already as powerful as her father, thanks to the unchecked rage he could see burning in her eyes when she attacked him. But it was no matter, the desired objective had been achieved. Kane smiled at the wilting crystal he had carelessly tossed onto one of the beds, wincing as a fresh rush of blood emerged from his split lip from the effort. Fable's crystal is mine. That leaves just one more before I'm finally reunited with Cecil. He couldn't remember the last time he had been so greatly anticipating the dawn of a new day. Truly, how long had it been since he felt his existence had any kind of purpose again? Capo.
No. No.
Theodore sighed and rolled over for what felt like the millionth time, his eyes opening to slits as he looked down at the floor next to him from his bed. The hooded man was twisted in his blanket, his cloak rolled up into a makeshift pillow, and was seizing in his sleep, his eyes screwed tightly shut and his forehead damp with fresh perspiration. He's having another nightmare, Theodore thought, biting his lip. The first time the hooded man had started screaming in his sleep, Theodore had to rush out of bed and shake him back to consciousness before the rest of the inn was given an impromptu wake-up call. They had been sequestered in a closet of a room, but the walls were paper-thin, as evidenced by Theodore being able to hear every obnoxious noise pouring down from the pub above and from the bigger chambers next to them. Even after Theodore had forced him to wake, he hadn't actually acknowledged the boy's presence, his eyes had merely rolled into the back of his head, and he passed back out in silence. Theodore had climbed back into bed, staring at the ceiling for hours before finally falling back asleep himself, and now here they were again.
Hey!
Theodore whispered, precariously balancing on the edge of the bed as he reached down to touch his shoulder.
Wake up.
He glanced at the clock hanging on the wall, barely illuminated by the sporadic fireworks that were still launching outside. Some of them were so loud that they shook Theodore's bed. They reminded him of the practice drills the Red Wings would execute on late summer nights whenever Sid did their annual cannon maintenance.
It's well after midnight,
Theodore muttered, giving the man's shoulder a hard shove. Another firework exploded, briefly illuminating the room in a flash of light. Theodore didn't notice the door sliding open, or the wiry saber that materialized behind his head, Baron's crest emblazoned in the hilt.
We've got him,
a cold voice muttered, and Theodore felt a clammy hand on his neck while the blade brushed against his earlobe. Theodore's eyes widened as the hooded man snapped back to consciousness, his hand flying to his blade he had kept tucked at his side.
Look out, Theodore! AHHH!
Theodore screamed, diving forward onto the bed as the hooded man's blade ran through the assailant. He cringed as he felt the shower of blood scatter over his back, and heard the bed screech as the hooded man sprung from the floor, using it as a platform to propel himself forward into the two other soldiers who had burst in the room. Moments later, they were slain, and Theodore lifted his head to observe the carnage sprayed across the walls, a choked wail escaping his lips. It was drowned out by another firework, the crystalline blue of his eyes igniting with an eerie silver light as they took in the decaying bodies that were returning to dust.
Who were those soldiers just now? They weren't human. Not anymore.
The hooded man sheathed his blade.
They probably thought we managed to get out of Baron by sea and followed us to Capo that way.
Theodore covered his mouth, lowering his head as he swallowed the acid that had formed in his throat. One of the soldiers whose skulls had started to dissipate had seemed so familiar. Was it someone Theodore had seen every day, or just recently because the soldier had been assigned to tail him? He realized that he had never paid much attention either way, and that just made him even sicker. The hooded man shook his head, sighing with dismay as Theodore turned whiter.
Theodore! Don't show them mercy just because they're from Baron. Otherwise, you'll wind up like that yourself. I know.
Theodore whimpered.
This, more than anything, proves that we need to stay on the move. When day breaks, we'll make for the underground waterway to the northeast so we can cross into Damcyan and Fabul. You still want to figure out who is controlling the Red Wings fleet, right?
Theodore raised his head, his hands clutching the sheets that had pooled in his lap. His voice shook with his reply, he couldn't bring himself to look in his savior's eyes.
Yes, of course. No matter who is doing this, I can't let them get away with disgracing the Red Wings' name. And if I find them, they might lead me to my parents, too.
The hooded man turned away, directing his attention to the mess that would need to be cleaned up before they departed in what would now be just a few short hours. He heard Theodore shrink down back into the bed, the blankets sliding over his shaken form. He glanced over his shoulder at the boy, nearly gasping aloud when he saw Cecil's cold, lightless eyes staring back at him. But when he blinked, the despondent, crystal blue gaze once again belonged to Theodore, and the prince rolled over, burying his face in the pillow. That's what I'm afraid of. The next morning, the crystal of wind hanging from a chain wrapped around his bare waist, Kane prepared for his departure to Damcyan. His homecoming from Fabul had been uneventful by design. He hadn't even let himself go inside the castle upon his return, as much as he was hoping he would come across a familiar face from the past, a certain white mage, perhaps. With the exception of Rosa, he wasn't sure if anyone else left in the castle would give him a straight answer about what was going on, since it appeared that all of the soldiers were now in a trance or fully transformed into something no longer quite human. Kane harbored the suspicion that the mysterious girl, whoever she was keeping Cecil under close watch. He knew she would not allow for any accidental early encounters. And as irritating as it was, Kane could only assume that Rosa was close by Cecil's side. They had been a package deal 17 years ago, and he had little reason to believe anything had changed that drastically in the time he was gone. That had been the final nail in the coffin for any ambitions he had carried in regard to exploring Baron after Fabul's conquest, and so he had slept on the uncomfortable bed inside the airship and nursed his wounds solo throughout the night. I probably made it easier on Cecil, being away for so long, Kane thought to himself with a bereaved smirk as he contorted his body to reach all the abrasions Yang's little brat had gifted him during their battle. But that all ends today. Pouring another bottle of antiseptic on the cotton rag he had created by ripping apart one of the sheets on the bed, he pressed the soaked fabric to his lower back, grinding his teeth while the flesh burned beneath. His armor was tossed to the corner of the room in a heap, the maw of his helmet pointed toward the ceiling. Kane pushed his hair away from his eyes, where it had fallen in a waterfall of silk over his shoulders and chest, free from the blood-stained sash that had been tying it back. After he finished dressing his wounds for the morning, Kane retrieved his armor, carefully locking each plate into place with a satisfying click, picturing Cecil's bones cracking between his fingers with each sound that rang out in the hollow of the ship. He could hear the soldiers boarding the ship from above, pounding monotonously without conversation or misstep. Of course, they had nothing to say to each other, and they had been given only one objective when Kane had ordered those who had survived Fabul to leave him the night before, get him to Damcyan at morning's light without fail. Kane didn't know how much time had passed once he collapsed on the bed and closed his eyes. His wounds were still stinging when he drifted back into a nightmare-laced sleep. But before he knew it, a hesitant knock landed on the door, and a muffled voice roused him back to life.
Sir, we will be landing in Damcyan shortly.
Kane opened one eye, grunted in the affirmative, and heard the soldier walk away. He blindly reached over the side of the bed, retrieving his helmet. This won't be like Fabul. Damcyan crumbled handily 17 years ago. Knowing Edward, he'll just hand over the crystal. He will be terrified of the past repeating itself. And I highly doubt he has a guard dog of a daughter. Best I just take care of this myself. Exiting the berth and climbing to the deck, Kane leaned over the railing, his smile widening as Damcyan Castle came into view.
You all wait for me here,
he called out over his shoulder, and one of the soldiers behind him cleared his throat confusedly.
But, sir.
Kane shook his head, his eyes never leaving the castle as he ran his tongue over his teeth, sucking in a sharp breath.
Look, I know you're being controlled, but at least value your lives a little.
The soldier shrugged.
Yes, sir. But if things prove to be more difficult than anticipated, don't count on it.
When their ship made the landing, Kane leapt down from the deck in one graceful jump, not bothering to wait for the ramp to be lowered. Gazing up at the castle gates, he realized that he had never actually been in Damcyan proper despite the kingdom being one of Baron's closer neighbors. His career as a dragoon had never taken him to the desert region that was known mostly for trade, and he could scarcely remember when Golbez had bombed them in order to steal the Crystal of Fire during the war. The most he could recall was being high in the air, on a ship Golbez had commandeered when he had taken over the Red Wings, most likely, his vision fading in and out with each labored beat of his heart as an explosion of flames and smoke blossomed from the desert below. He remembered not understanding what was going on, and wondering if he was having some sort of twisted nightmare after the earthquake had missed, wondering if Cecil had made it out alive. The next time he had opened his eyes, he had been spirited away to the Tower of Zot, and was receiving orders from Golbez about their next target, Fabul.
Your friend Cecil may be waiting for us,
Golbez had boomed behind his menacing black helmet.
Is that going to be a problem? Why would it?
Kane remembered replying dutifully.
He's a goddamn traitor.
The castle gates were abandoned, but not locked. Kane shoved his way through, the doors swinging wildly on their hinges as he swept into the courtyard. Other than the rustling of the flowers that were swaying lazily in the desert breeze, there wasn't a sound, and nary a soul to be seen. Marching through the courtyard to the grand hall, Kane's eyes contemplated each portrait that was hanging in the otherwise empty corridors, all replicas, he was sure, since the originals would have been destroyed in the bombing, of the past 6 rulers of Damcyan, as they were on the day of their coronation. At the end of the hall, he came to the seventh portrait, the only original piece, of Edward, looking exactly as Cain had remembered from 17 years ago. He was dressed in ceremonial robes, and not the garb of a bard, but the same ghostly, pathetic gaze that transcended any pomp followed Cain as he made his way to the next room. You were a fool to come to Cecil's aid that day in Fabul's crystal chamber, Cain thought to himself as he took another quick inventory of the next room, which appeared to be some sort of commerce square, unsurprisingly as abandoned as the rest of the castle. Maybe Damsion's military wasn't as inept as he had thought, they had either spotted the Red Wings' approach, or someone had passed along a friendly warning. Edward. All Cecil's friendship has gifted you is suffering and loss, first your father-in-law, and even today, his efforts to build Baron into a military superpower has effectively defanged Damsion. Would you be able to look me in the eyes and tell me that he's truly redeemed himself for everything he has done to you? He reached over his shoulder, retrieving his lance with his left hand. With his right, he pushed open the throne room doors, pausing in the threshold as a rush of heat from the blazing fireplace rushed over him and immediately noticing the lone figure standing in the center of the chamber. Cain's eyes found Edward's, and he found himself momentarily taken aback by the king's proud stance. The rise of the gilded throne behind Edward made him seem much taller than his svelte 5 feet 8 inches, and gone was the silver and ivory harp that he had clung to like a security blanket in the crystal of Wind's chamber so long ago. In its place was a slender dagger hanging from his hip, the hilt glimmering tantalizingly in the light of the fire. The shadows set in his pale, sunken face were pronounced and obvious, like fresh bruises, but the furor in his eyes was blistering, igniting his entire form like a furnace. You? Cain trailed off, his fingers curling tighter around his lance. Edward took a feathery light step forward, his boot barely brushing the stone steps that had temporarily elevated him to Cain's height. He spoke softly, shaken to his core by who it was standing before him, but nevertheless, with underlying resolve.
I never expected to see you here, Cain.
The underground waterway. Theodore and the hooded man, thoroughly soaked to their chests from their trek through the first half of the underground waterway that connected Capo to Damsion Castle, trudged into a small, relatively dry cavern that was stationed above the rushing waters of the river that was spiraling through the cavern from the northernmost falls. Calcium-encrusted stalactites dangled from the ceiling, the occasional drip of runoff from their pointed ends resonating like the last notes of a concerto. Theodore tugged at his tunic, twisting the fabric in his hands to squeeze out the excess water, the droplets splashing on faintly glowing crystals embedded in the ground at their feet.
Hey, aren't these those crystals that repel monsters that we saw in Mist Cave?
Theodore asked, and the hooded man looked around, hands on his hips.
That's right. We'll rest here and take advantage of their protection.
He nodded toward a rotting pile of wood and stones a few feet away from them.
Seems to be a popular enough spot for travelers past. But I'm just fine.
Theodore frowned, releasing the now wrung-out fabric.
Aren't you worried about Damsion and Fabul? We have to hurry.
The man shook his head.
You need to pace yourself and remember what we are up against. It's the two of us versus an entire army. Eventually, your adrenaline is going to run out, and I'm not hauling you out of here over my shoulders. We've got a while to go.
Theodore pressed his lips together, suddenly remembering that he had fallen back into a dead sleep after the soldiers had attacked them, and that his companion had probably been up the remainder of the night taking care of the aftermath.
Oh. All right, then.
He promptly collapsed on the ground, pressing his cheek to his palm and closing his eyes. The hooded man dug around in his provisions, retrieving a bomb crank and tossing it on the ground in front of them, the makeshift fire pit erupting in flames.
That's our last one,
the hooded man said, and Theodore opened one eye.
We'll be able to get more supplies in Damsion. I haven't seen King Edward in ages, but I'm sure he'll help us. He and my father are good friends. But even if they weren't, he's so kind and gentle, he would never turn away someone in need. Is that so?
The hooded man asked, sitting across from Theodore and crossing his legs.
How long has it been since you've spoken with the king? I can't remember,
Theodore admitted.
I was so little I can hardly remember what he looks like. Hopefully, he remembers me. But he and my father speak often enough. Usually, my father just visits him, it's easier with the airship. Of course.
Theodore slid down to the ground, his eyes blinking sleepily as he turned on his side.
You know those graves in Capo? King Edward was once engaged to the girl buried there, Anna. But my father said she died during the war, right before they were supposed to get married. He was there when it happened, he said. King Edward could hardly bring himself to leave her side, even as their castle was burning down all around them. That sounds horrible,
the hooded man said quietly, his eyes locked on the fire. Within, he could see it all over again, Damcyan crumbling into a sea of ash that washed away with the desert winds, her people becoming one with their kingdom's lands forevermore.
A lot of atrocities were committed in Baron's name back then, the sacking of Damcyan being no exception. It makes me fearful for what's to come. I can only pray this is not a repeat of the past. It's not.
Theodore frowned.
That was Golbez's doing, and he's gone now. My parents made sure of that. Baron would never become someone's puppet again.
There was a hesitant intake of breath. The hooded man tilted his head.
What exactly do you know about Golbez, Theodore? Well, the answer is... not much,
Theodore frowned.
My parents' encounters with him are a sore subject. He seemed to make it a personal mission to torture them just because they had the audacity to stand up to his terror. But I've heard enough from others to know how awful he was, that something set him off on a bad path if he was so willing to help Zemus purge us from the planet.
Willing?
I see. Well, at any rate, neither you nor I have enough information to know who is behind the revival of the Red Wings, so to speak. But whoever it is, I'm beginning to suspect that perhaps it wasn't just monsters that brought down your ship, but rather, a calculated attack designed by this individual. What? I've been thinking about what a strange, and unfortunate, coincidence it was that Baron's most powerful fleet happened to be destroyed at the same time as the return of the Twin Moon. At first, I thought the monsters had perhaps gone mad, but... You think someone is controlling the monsters?
Theodore whispered.
Meaning? We were targeted so that we would be out of the way for an invasion. Possibly. With the Red Wings gone, the keystone to Baron's security is removed, and the enemy can move in. It would explain why the soldiers are after you. They didn't complete their mission if a Red Wing survived. But...
Theodore closed his eyes, the flush in his cheeks from their hike in the waterway draining into a pale, sickly green.
Oh gods!
The hooded man pressed his fingers to his temple. He had been tossing around the idea of proposing his theory to Theodore since they had arrived in Capo, but now he was wondering if he had made a mistake. And if he told Theodore the truth, that he had seen Cecil and Baron, but that the king had been a shadow of his former self, would Theodore turn right around and flee, despite the now known danger? After a few minutes of silence, he reached out toward the still boy, who had rolled over so that his back was to him. He wondered if Theodore didn't want him to see that he was crying.
Theodore. Emo. There.
Theodore whimpered, curling into himself tighter. The hooded man pulled back his hand, his eyes stinging as he watched the boy sleep. Rosa. Damcyan. Cain raised his lance, sweeping it across the throne room as if he were a monarch addressing his people.
You cleared the castle for me, didn't you? Nice to see a show of courtesy from you, even after all this time.
Edward crossed his arms over his chest, his mouth a straight line. Still, his gaze did not leave Cain's, and it was starting to get a bit unnerving.
Millimeter hum. Will you continue this act of kindness and hand over the crystal of fire? Is that what you're really after?
Edward asked testily, and Cain shrugged.
It's not the main thrust of my business. But yes. So what are you really after? I'm going to kill Cecil.
A chill shot down Edward's spine, but still, he did not waver. There must be a connection. Cecil's strange behavior, and now Cain's sudden appearance. Yet both men want the crystals? I have to draw out any information I can. Exhaling slowly, he merely reacted to this news with a shake of his head, as if Cain had said something so asinine that it didn't even register.
Have you seen him yet? Not yet,
Cain cocked an eyebrow.
That's why I'm here.
Edward smiled outwardly, but inside, he was shook. Cecil was alive and well mere hours ago. Why would Cain have not gone straight to Baron to see for himself? Does this mean he's not collecting the crystals on Cecil's behalf? Are they both working for the woman whose voice Harley and I heard in the Whisperweed?
I see. Sadly, I'm afraid I can't let you have my crystal.
Kane jumped forward so fast that Edward didn't have time to finish his sentence. When the dragoon landed, his lance was pressed to Edward's throat, standing close enough that Edward could feel his hot breath hitting him in the face like a rain of blows. Hissing between his teeth, Kane pressed inward.
Even if it costs your life.
Edward swallowed, his eyes gazing down at the tip of the lance dragging across his Adam's apple before defiantly lifting them back to Kane's dusky glare.
That's right.
Kane smirked, pulling his lance back and licking his lips.
Let me put you out of your misery, then.
He grabbed Edward by the throat, roughly shoving the stunned man into his throne and preparing to bring the lance down upon his head.
Kane, stop.
A melodious voice cried out, causing both men to turn away from each other and face the leftmost corridor. There came the sound of harried footsteps, and a figure in white appeared before the two of them, spirals of blonde hair raining over her shoulders, the curls spilling over her breasts with each distraught breath. Heavy-lidded, bloodshot eyes were rimmed in coral from countless nights of unrest, and her Cupid's bow-shaped lips were split with hairline cracks, some of them tinged with a fresh spray of blood. Her hands, white, delicate, as fragile as bone china, yet capable of inflicting so much torment, were suddenly wrapped around Kane's lance, inching it away from Edward's skull with an otherworldly strength that a creature in her condition should not have been able to summon. An ornate pink diamond adorning her ring finger blinded Kane's glare, reflecting firelight. But when he stared down into those fierce, lustrous eyes, it was as if time had ceased its flow. He was transported to another world, a star in the most distant of universes where he no longer suffered or felt anything but inviolable, a place where he awoke to angels whispering his name, not darkness-stained nightmares, a place where soft hands placated the ache, and where tender hearts made him remember how deliciously wonderful it was to be human, to be alive. It felt almost vulgar, the way he desperately drank her in, but it had been 17 long, tortuous years, and he hadn't realized how starved he was for her until she had materialized before him, the living, breathing miracle he had prayed for since the day he had abandoned himself. Her name danced enticingly on the tip of his tongue, just saying it aloud made him feel like he would be brought closer to the gods themselves, but he feared as soon as it left his lips, the vision before him would pop like a soap bubble, disappearing forever into the ether.
Rosa.
The underground waterway. It had only been a short amount of time that Theodore had slept. He woke up with a start, half of his hair matted down against his face as he shot up in place and glanced around worriedly.
I fell asleep,
he cried, scrambling to his feet.
Why did you let me do that?
The hooded man, who had spent the entire time staring at the fire and occasionally changing his position so that his clothes would dry faster, didn't bother looking up.
Our purpose coming here was to rest, and you rested. What else did you want me to do?
Theodore crossed his arms over his chest.
Okay, you made your point. I was more tired than I thought. But I did have a wonderful dream. What?
The hooded man blinked, rising to his feet.
It was my mother. I saw her again.
Theodore smiled happily.
She embraced me in the courtyards of Baron, and told me I needed to be strong. Everything felt so real, I could even smell her perfume again.
He closed his eyes, scrunching his scarf against his face and inhaling deeply.
I had a dream about her before I became a knight, so I think this bodes well. That's great,
the hooded man offered, smiling crookedly.
I'm sorry if I upset you before.
Theodore shook his head.
Please don't apologize. You've been thinking about what I should have been deliberating this entire time. I can't remove the target from my back, but...
He trailed off, looking away.
But what? It's nothing,
Theodore smiled weakly.
I've just got to be strong, like Mother told me in my dream. I know I can't rely on you forever. Once you find Kane, then you'll do what needs done and go back home, right? There will be no need for you to get any further entangled in this mess. Theodore.
But Theodore had hastily turned away, exiting the cave with his arms wrapped around himself. The hooded man sighed, staring down at his boots. A few moments later, an excited cry carried back to him as he attempted to stomp out their fire.
I see sunlight.
When the man had joined Theodore once again near the cavern's exit, he surveyed their surroundings and shook his head. They were still enclosed by mountains, and they had not yet crossed the northern falls that acted as the unofficial gateway to Damsion. He pointed in the distance across the fields, where another cave opening was awaiting them.
We aren't through this yet. Watch yourself. Right.
Theodore exclaimed, his voice trembling slightly as he took the lead and marched forward. The hooded man watched him go, his heart sinking as he fell in step behind the boy. Being brave does not mean you have to pretend to be unafraid. Theodore, as the Holy Paladin's heir, do you truly understand what may be playing out here? Something far more sinister than a mere target is on your back. What will you do when you have to face the truth? But you are right about one thing. I may not be there when it happens. After crossing into the new cavern, Theodore had stopped at the ledge of a cliff, pouting in confusion as the roar of a waterfall exploded below, the spray dancing over his skin like morning dew. When the hooded man approached from behind, Theodore shook his head.
It's just a dead end.
The hooded man glanced over the ledge, and tried not to laugh.
What dead end? You got the guts to jump in.
Theodore tried to blink away the vision that had suddenly popped into his head of being snapped in half by a torrent of raging water.
Of course.
He looked up at his companion to see if he was being serious, and unfortunately, all signs pointed to yes. The hooded man smirked.
Time to see what you're really made of. Why don't you go first?
Theodore swallowed, swiping the mist out of his eyes as he took another long look at the waterfall, which seemed to suddenly double in size and intensity.
Yes, sir.
Closing his eyes, Theodore took an awkward, flying leap, screaming at the top of his lungs until he was silenced by the churning waters below, his body sinking beneath the murky black water like a coffin being lowered into its grave. Damn Cyan.
Rosa.
Cain whispered again, giving in to her insistent shoving and finally lowering the lance. She stared up at him, her face twisted in confusion as she forced herself squarely between him and Edward, her hands still clinging to his weapon. He watched as a bead of sweat trailed down her temple, clinging to the curve of her cheek as it made its descent.
Cain? Your mind hasn't been.
Rosa trailed off, and he shook his head, his heart pounding as he yanked the lance out of her grasp, turning his back to her.
No. I'm acting on my own volition.
Rosa bit her lip, reaching for his shoulder.
Really?
He glanced down at her hand, and was met once again by the glare of that damnable gaudy trinket. It suddenly hit him just what exactly the ring symbolized, and why he had never seen it before, and he felt the momentary peace that had washed over him when she called his name go up in flames. He laughed, shaking his head as he grasped her hand in his, lacing their fingers like an intricate weaving.
Yes, really. And once I kill Cecil, you will be mine, Rosa. Cain.
Rosa protested, trying to pull away without success. It was as if all of her strength was sapped away just by looking at him.
You can't be serious.
The throne room doors flew open once more, and this time, the three of them were joined by the company of soldiers that had come with Cain on the airship. A stunned Edward could only watch, wide-eyed, as they swarmed the throne room, all facing Cain to wait for his orders. Cain yanked Rosa forward so that she was at his side, indicating to the soldiers that they were not to touch her. They had technically disobeyed his earlier request by coming after him, but he supposed he had taken longer than was anticipated. Rosa's appearance had thrown a wrench into what was supposed to be a quick and painless assassination.
Sadly, time's up.
Cain shrugged, turning back toward Edward and squeezing tighter as Rosa squirmed in his grip.
Give me the final crystal.
Final? Rosa cringed. How could he possibly have gathered the crystals so quickly? What in the world happened after we fled Baron? Edward pushed himself to his feet, glowering.
I believe I've already made myself clear. What? I refuse. Run, Edward.
Rosa cried, but instead, he reached into his pocket, retrieving a small, gunmetal gray box and sliding the clasp, causing the lid to spring open. A hazy flash of red light and billowing smoke filled the room, coils of fire rising into the air and exploding into clusters of fully grown bombs. The snaggle-toothed creatures tittered in excitement as they began to charge about the throne room, smashing into pillars and exploding on contact, sending slabs of marble flying like projectile weapons. Others body slammed the Baronian soldiers, clinging to them with their spindly claws and self-destructing, sending clouds of dust and ash raining in the air as Rosa screamed and fell back into Cain in shock, trying to reconcile the fact that every soldier before her was actually a monster in disguise. He pulled her tightly into his chest, glaring at Edward as the king silently closed the box, tossing it aside while the bombs made quick work of the remaining soldiers, destroying most of the throne room in the process.
A carnelian signet.
Cain hissed, and Edward stepped aside just in time to dodge a flaming chunk of ceiling that came crashing down.
Souvenir from Baron. All the better for me.
Cain laughed, brandishing his lance once more and sweeping low to knock Edward to his feet. Edward fell forward, tumbling down the stairs from his throne as Rosa screamed and yanked away from Cain, rushing to catch Edward. He fell into her arms, her knees buckling beneath his weight as she struggled to steady him. His dagger clattered to the floor, unnoticed to the two of them.
Thank you, Rosa.
Edward gasped.
Now get out of here. You have to find. No.
Rosa shrieked.
I won't go without you and Harley. Honestly, Rosa, what would Cecil say if he saw you two like this?
Cain smirked, shoving Rosa out of the way and burying his fist into Edward's face. Edward howled in pain as a rush of blood erupted from his nose, stumbling to the floor once again as the color drained from Rosa's cheeks.
Cain, stop this. Cain.
She threw himself at him as he loomed over Edward, wrapping her arms around his waist and shoving him down to the floor, his head slamming against the foot of Edward's throne as she crawled atop his legs in an attempt to pin him, tossing his lance away. His ears ringing inside his helmet, Cain dizzily lifted his gaze, cursing under his breath as he felt something cold and sharp press into his back. As he slid his hand behind him while trying to kick Rosa off, he realized Edward had lost his dagger, and he had just lucked out in finding it. Closing his fingers around the hilt of the blade, Cain ignored the threatening throbs originating in the back of his skull and sat up, pushing Rosa away and shakily aiming with his non-dominant hand. The dagger flew from his fingers, plunging into Edward's shoulder just a hair's width beneath his plate armor. Edward's scream filled the room, and Rosa whirled around, hurriedly chanting a curative spell under her breath. Cain slapped his hand over her mouth, disrupting the incantation and dragging her with him to pour over Edward's defeated form. Edward was gasping for air, and it was hard to tell where the blood from his nose started and the blood from his shoulder wound ended in the gruesome bath that splashed across his chest and neck. He looked up at Cain as his and Rosa's shadows blanketed him, grimacing.
So this is what you really want? Edward.
Rosa mumbled against Cain's hand, and Edward's eyes slid shut, his breathing deeply labored and rattling in his throat like a screaming kettle left over the fire.
Ah. That's it, that's exactly it,
Cain smiled. He released Rosa, bending down to examine something glimmering that had caught his eye. It was a ruby signet ring bearing the crest of Damsion, and it looked far too heavy for Edward's frail, blood-stained fingers. He watched Rosa's face as he reached for the ring, and saw the slightest sliver of panic ignite in her gaze. That was the only hint he needed indicating that somehow, this silly trinket would lead him to the crystal. Plucking the ring off of Edward's finger, he turned back to Rosa, his smile widening as she pressed her back to the wall, glaring up at him.
Rosa. I'm going to need you to tell me where the crystal is, or else I'll have to finish this poor bastard off. I won't.
Rosa shook her head defiantly, her eyes watering. She knew if she tried to cast another spell, he would just stop her again. She had to pray that Edward could hang on just a little while longer while she tried to talk some sense into Cain.
Wake up, Cain. You have to wake up. I already told you. I am awake,
Cain said softly, trailing the signet's ruby delicately across the curve of her cheek. She shivered from the sensation of the cold stone running over her skin, shrinking beneath him.
I have awoken. And my long, long nightmare will finally come to a close as soon as the light is extinguished from Cecil's eyes. After that, what was meant to be can finally pass.
He slammed his palm in the wall above Rosa's head, causing her to shriek and duck as he pressed his body to hers, entangling his fingers in the short hairs above the nape of her neck and tugging just hard enough to force her to look up at him. The crystal of wind hanging from his waist pressed painfully into her abdomen, and she resisted the urge to cry out.
Now, Rosa. Tell me where the passage to the crystal of fire is. Or Edward will die along with your precious Cecil.
Her darkened orbs focused hatefully onto his own, the flecks of gold and emerald that had manifested themselves over the long years enkindled with such a ferocity and heavenly luminescence that he could barely tear himself away, even as he could palpably feel her obliterating what remained of his soul with each cutting flash of her stare. His chest was aching divinely with each hollow bang of his heart. Yes, that's it. Tear me apart with your immaculate hands, drown me in moonlight, curse me with each breath that fills your body. Dream of whatever it is you need to do, just as long as your eyes never leave mine again. The underground waterway. Theodore bobbed to the surface for air just as he felt an obnoxiously loud splash smack him in the face. Cursing under his breath, he rubbed at his eyes and coughed, the briny water burning his nasal passages and throat. A few moments later, the hooded man popped up beside him, pulling down his hood and shaking his mane of wet hair like a drenched dog before gathering it in his fingers and wringing out the excess water.
Nice work, Theodore. We'll have to polish your technique a bit, though. The screaming and flailing is not going to impress any girls at the local swimming hole. Not exactly something I was ever concerned about,
Theodore glowered.
Since I'm never going to take a girl, I like to jump off a waterfall like a lunatic. Then you don't know what you're missing,
the hooded man whistled, and Theodore sighed, blowing a tendril of wet hair out of his face. Treading the water as he turned away from the hooded man, he spotted what looked like a shadowy opening in the center of the waterfall ahead of them.
There's an exit behind the waterfall,
Theodore called out, starting to swim ahead. The hooded man turned around, raising his hand.
Theodore, wait for me.
As Theodore approached the exit, a slimy white and red striped tentacle rose from the depths, snaking behind Theodore's trailing scarf. Just as the hooded man screamed a warning, Theodore turned around, his eyes widening as the tentacle rose and came straight for his head.
Slow!
Theodore cried, and the tentacle was wrapped in a pulsing gray light. The speed it was falling through the air reduced so drastically that Theodore could count aloud to 20 before it would hit its desired target. But rather than admiring his upcoming demise in slow motion, he instead took the opportunity to dive out of the way, retrieving his sword from his waterlogged scabbard and launching himself into a dual attack with the hooded man to cleave the tentacle in two. The spell broken, the severed tentacle began to thrash about back in normal time, spraying an inky purple blood across the surface of the lake as it sunk beneath the waves. Another tentacle burst out of the water to take the place of its fallen brethren, and the two men shot each other a look.
Guess we aren't getting through without a fight,
the hooded man shrugged.
Think you can do that spell 8 more times? E8.
Theodore gasped.
I don't know if I have the mana for that. What makes you think there are 8 more of these things?
The tentacle was joined by a twin, and both swung inward in an attempt to trap their assailants in a pincer attack. Theodore and the hooded man dove under the water to get away, propelling themselves forward and surfacing on opposite sides of the lake.
Only 7 more tentacles.
The hooded man called from across the lake, and Theodore shrieked as a third tentacle rose before him, quickly slinging another slow spell and following up with several deep, bloody hacks from his sword. The hooded man was jumping between small, rocky islands that were scattered throughout the lake in an effort to distract his assailants while he waited for Theodore to cast the additional spells. Theodore had to shake himself from his trance as his gaze followed the hooded man. He hadn't perhaps realized until now just how agile he was on both the ground and in the air. It was incredible to behold. Who is he? Theodore finally cast the spells, the hooded man shouting his thanks as he took another leap in the air, thrusting his sword toward his feet and running it through the entirety of the first of his 2 tentacles, not letting up until he sank into the water. He said he used to be in the military. But can you really learn to move like that just from being a common soldier? But Theodore's thoughts were interrupted when he gained a new opponent, yet another tentacle, this one slightly shorter than the rest. He climbed to the safety of a nearby island to lure the tentacle closer, lighting it up with a fresh slow spell when it was near enough.
Then what's the 8th thing?
Theodore asked, jumping in surprise as the hooded man leapt to his side and slaughtered the slowed tentacle as he landed.
That,
the hooded man said, pointing back toward the waterfall.
It's called an octocrocan.
A final triad of tentacles had emerged, and along with them, a snarling, cone-shaped mass of scales and pink-scarred flesh that was the size of a tree and had sharpened teeth that you just knew were specially made for tearing through bones of whatever lesser monsters made their way down to the lake as midnight snacks. Theodore shrank back as the creature's erratic red pupils locked onto him, its legs frantically kicking up waves of water as it skittered toward them like an overgrown, lopsided spider, practically flying over the lake's surface even with only 3 legs left.
Ah!
Theodore screamed, closing his eyes and thrusting his hands forward as the hooded man braced himself. He could feel the drain on his magic starting to make every move a major effort, even his brain's synapses weren't firing off as rapidly as he tried to picture a twisting, crippling fog wrapping itself around the entire monster and not just the independent legs.
Slow.
Theodore felt all of the breath eject from his body, as if he had just been punched in the diaphragm. Sinking down to his knees, he moaned sluggishly, hearing his sword clatter next to him.
Nice job!
The hooded man exclaimed, launching himself off the island toward the beast. Theodore dared to open one eye and nearly fell into the water in shock. He had actually managed to group cast the spell exactly as he had pictured in his mind. What remained of the octo-kraken was twitching with painful lethargy a few yards away from the island, and Theodore could see the vein-busting strain of its bulging eyes as it tried to survey its gaze back and forth to no avail. The hooded man was using the collection of raised, staggered tentacles as stepping stones, diving over the octo-kraken's head from above and thrusting his sword through its wide-open mouth. Theodore heard a sickening snapping sound, and the hooded man's blade broke through the rear of the monster's head, sending with it another spray of putrid purple blood. Moments later, it was all over. The hooded man swam back to the island Theodore was trapped on as the octo-kraken dissolved into a pool of dust that drifted on the lake's surface, mixed with swirling spills of blood. Theodore managed to pull himself into a sitting position, and the hooded man reached into his supplies, retrieving an ether. Theodore took it gratefully, tearing the cork out with his teeth and swallowing the medicine in one gulp.
That was intense.
Theodore muttered against the mouth of the bottle. He let it drop into the lake, sighing in relief as the numbness that had started to drown his tendons gave way to soothing warmth.
If this is how violent the monsters are getting, then we must fear the worst.
The hooded man shook his head, retrieving Theodore's sword and handing it back to him.
There have always been rumors of a beast guarding this lake, but it's been said to be defeated many times before. Whether it is being reanimated like the other undead of the waterway or something worse. Neither option bodes well. It's a constant evolution to better itself each life cycle. Then we just have to evolve along with it, right?
Theodore asked softly, gazing at his hands.
That's what the Lunarians had hoped for us. That we could one day evolve to their level, so we could live together.
He looked up at the hooded man, unblinking.
I'm a quarter Lunarian, but attempting that spell just now nearly knocked me out. Does that mean I'm not marked for survival?
The hooded man furrowed his brow.
Instead of looking at it as a failure, why can't you look at it as a success? You made things go a lot better for us than they could have been.
Theodore looked away, pressing his lips together.
How come you didn't seem surprised just now? About what? About me telling you I was a quarter Lunarian. It's not exactly common knowledge.
The hooded man sat back on his heels, his face unreadable, like always.
Maybe not, but I've been in the Mysidian region for a long time, and they are quite familiar with the concept of Lunarians and the truth about how magic came to the blue planet, about Cecil's connection with the father of magic. It's not hard to put two and two together. Besides, whether you believe it or not, you have tremendous untapped potential that no ordinary human would ever carry. The light that led me to you the night the moon returned, otherworldly was a good way to describe it.
Theodore smiled a little. He knew the hooded man wasn't exactly lying, that was the feeling he had gotten during most of their conversations like this, but he wasn't telling the truth, either, a lie by omission, one might call it.
And what drew you to that light? Why didn't you just run away? Most people would have, don't you think?
The hooded man rose, extending his hand to Theodore. Theodore grasped onto it, letting the man tug him to his feet.
The short answer is that I've run away enough in my life. And the long answer? Sometimes those of us imbued deepest in the darkness are the ones who crave the light the most.
Theodore shivered involuntarily, dropping his hand as he watched the hooded man turn away and promptly dive back into the lake. His head dipped beneath the water as he swam under the liquefying remains of the octo-kraken, and moments later he appeared at the base of the waterfall, motioning for Theodore to join him. And just how much darkness can one heart sustain before it is lost? If he assassinates Cain, will that be what tips the balance forevermore? And if I am complicit in his mission, what does that mean for my heart as well? After a short climb through the passageway behind the waterfall, Theodore and the hooded man found themselves unexpectedly bathed in the warmth of the surface sunlight. The grass beneath their boots crunched as they walked, and pools of sand began to fill the widening gaps between patches of growth. They were approaching the Damsayan desert. Theodore, the hooded man frowned, suddenly throwing his arm in front of the boy. Theodore stumbled as he tried to catch himself, following the hooded man's gaze. Damsayan Castle rose in the far distance, but something black was twisting in the skies high above, melding into the low-hanging clouds. Smoke? Another object emerged from the veil of darkness, blades charging relentlessly through the air as a body of shining crimson punctured the sky, growing larger by the second.
A Baronian airship!
Theodore gasped. The hooded man lowered his head, pressing his hand to his mouth.
We're too late.
The Red Wings.
My work in Damcyan is done. Farewell, Edward.
Kane gave a blithe wave to the now smoke-engulfed castle keep from the bow of the ship, laughing to himself as the ship's autopilot finally kicked in and started to lift them from the ground. He gazed at the fading crystal of fire curled in his fingers, his ash-streaked complexion blinking back at him fourfold from each of the crystal's faces. Behind him, Rosa hurriedly punched in a few keys on the control pad, trying every code she could possibly think of that would override the ship's commands and get them back into manual. She wasn't sure where exactly she could fly in a short window of time, but perhaps she could fend off Kane long enough to get to Fabul and force him to return the crystal. She knew that no matter what, she couldn't let the crystals out of her sight. She was the last chance they had to return to safety before Kane executed whatever his plans were for them.
Give it up,
Kane hissed from behind her, and she nearly jumped a foot in the air, spinning around to face him. He responded by shoving her against the steering wheel of the ship, the polished oak spokes digging into her back as he smiled and lifted a delicate glass bell between his fingers.
Do you know what this is? What?
Rosa blinked, and Kane rang the bell directly above her nose. However, no sound came. Upon closer inspection she saw that it was missing a clapper.
Ah, I guess it's been a while since our last magical studies course, hey? This is a silent bell, as the name not so creatively implies. It gives those unworthy of magical gifts like myself the power to cast silence on a target of our choosing. Luckily, my friends that Edward so carelessly disposed of had some supplies stashed on the ship that were actually useful. I apologize ahead of time, I just needed some extra insurance that you would not interfere with our homecoming flight with your magic. I'm sure you learned a spell or two since we last saw each other.
Rosa reddened, pushing Kane off of her and immediately casting a hold spell. Enough was enough, she would just have to take the crystals by force. But after the words left her lips, nothing happened. Kane smiled slowly, shaking his head and crushing the spent bell into glimmering dust between his fingers, releasing it into rushing wind.
And I have plenty more where this came from, so don't try anything clever. All right.
He really silenced me. Rosa bit down on her lip, trying to summon all of the courage she had not to throw a hellacious fit and risk angering him further. He forced me to betray Edward, and now this. She eyed him warily as he brushed his hand off on his armor with such nonchalance that she could have almost been convinced that this was all just a terrible, cosmic-level joke.
Kane, you must stop this madness. Have you any idea what is happening? I have a feeling I know more than you do, dear.
Rosa reeled back, noticing the glowing satisfaction in his eyes as she did so. The past 24 hours had been such a whirlwind, she wasn't sure if she could really dispute his declaration. The night before, she had foolishly left Sid behind on the Enterprise, and had been caught by a company of soldiers. But she must have been carrying the blessings of the stars that night, for the soldiers had turned out to be from Damcyan. Sid had landed in a little-known lagoon off of Damcyan's western coast, and they had made it immediately clear that they were her allies and were not the originators of the attack on Baron from which they had fled. They escorted Sid and Rosa to the castle, explaining that Edward was out, but was expected back home shortly, also pledging their support to help Sid get the Enterprise back up and running again. But when Rosa and Sid learned from the Chancellor that Edward's errand had taken him to Baron, a new level of panic ensued. Damcyan, the second night after the moon's return.
The castle was overtaken by monsters,
Rosa whimpered, wrapped in a blanket that she hadn't left since setting foot on Damcyan's grounds.
Cecil sent us away, and he told us not to return under any circumstances. I fear he must be.
She clasped her hands to her mouth, letting out a string of strangled wails. She couldn't bring herself to say the words aloud.
And what of Prince Theodore?
The Chancellor asked gravely, and Rosa shook her head, too exhausted and dehydrated to summon any more tears. Sid held her close, his meaty hand clasped on the small of her back.
He's been missing since the day the moon returned. He was supposed to come home that morning, he wasn't there by the time we made our escape. I'm so sorry,
the Chancellor frowned, looking away and fretfully stroking his beard.
Your Highness, if I may be forward, I think your assumptions about King Cecil are incorrect. It would seem he survived Baron Castle's assault. Just the other day, he sent us a messenger warning us not to go near the meteorite that struck in the northeast and to leave its investigation to Baron. That was why King Edward wished to see him. He wanted to understand what purpose Baron had for getting involved with something that was not in your jurisdiction in the first place. What?
Sid blinked, and Rosa lifted her head.
But we know nothing of a meteor. Cecil never breathed a word of it to me. Nor me.
Sid interjected.
Besides, that's not like Cecil to send a messenger for something like that, he would have just gone to see Edward himself if he felt that strongly about it. I agree wholeheartedly,
the Chancellor said softly.
I didn't want Edward to go, but quite frankly, he insisted. He took Harley with him, also against better judgment. But I don't think Cecil would be trifling with a meteor if Baron were still under siege. I dare say, however, that there may be a connection between the two events. Oh gods!
Rosa sank to her knees, clutching the blanket tighter. She felt as if she had been presented a glimmer of hope that had been subsequently snatched right back out from under her nose.
But if Cecil is alive, why wouldn't have he sent for Sid and I by now? Isidore is with him, or...
She clasped her hand to her throbbing forehead, fever brimming beneath her fingertips.
I have to go back to Baron. Right now. Please, send someone to help fix our ship right away.
The Chancellor dithered nervously, not sure what to do. A belligerent, scholarly type like Harley, he could handle with no problems. A mourning, heartbroken, and confused queen was something else entirely. And now his own worst nightmare had come to life. Something sinister was taking hold in Baron, and their own king had walked steadfastly right into it.
Rosa.
Sid bent down, taking hold of her shoulders.
We should wait for Edward to return, so we can put all the pieces of the puzzle together. He'll be truthful about what he has found, and the Chancellor said Harley is with him, so I'm sure he'll be just fine.
He glanced up at the Chancellor.
Damn Scion will offer asylum to Queen Rosa, right? Of course.
The Chancellor frowned.
I would never dream of anything otherwise. But I fear any more discussion at this point may just upset everyone more. We should get the Queen to bed and await King Edward's homecoming. I'll send scouts post-haste to try to locate him. He was to only go straight to Baron and return, so surely he cannot be much longer. He had some guards with him, as well. Don't talk about me like I'm not here.
Rosa sniffled, and the Chancellor and Sid both shot each other worried glances.
I'll decide when I...
She doubled over, what little color she had regained draining from her face as she fell forward.
Your Highness. Rosa.
Damn Scion, the 3 days after the moon's return.
Rosa. I'm here now. I'm sorry I made you worry.
Ah. Warm, tenacious hands. Cecil, is it really you? A curtain of silky hair fell over her cheek. Without opening her eyes, she reached up, entwining her fingers in the locks and breathing in the earthy, familiar scent as she urged the figure to come closer with the wordless plea of her touch. Her heart danced vivaciously against her chest as she parted her lips, waiting for the one mouth in all of the universe that she knew as well as her own to renew their undying oath. But the force that crushed against her was cold and tinged with an insipid sweetness that she couldn't place. Her eyes sliding open, she saw a small, thin smile come into focus, lips tinged the color of deadly nightshade, and felt a rush of numbness overtake her veins. She realized she was paralyzed in place as the figure pulled further away into gathering shadows, a scream ensnared in her throat.
What in the world are you doing here?
Rosa lifted her head, cringing at the shriek that had followed the thunder of the throne room doors being thrown open. Her head was still throbbing from another night of intermittent sleep, and she couldn't stop herself from replaying the final nightmare she had had before Sid forced her awake, both utterly repulsed and entranced by the images that kept forcing themselves to the forefront of her shattered mind. Who was that in my dream? After bathing and dressing, she had followed Sid wordlessly down to the throne room from where she had been carried to bed the previous night, Harley's room, apparently, which had gone unused with its owner still absent, dragging Harley's comforter with her as her wooden sandals clicked ominously across the granite tiles. She was still freezing cold, despite the damp Scion desert heat and the warm bath she had been offered, her hair hanging down her back in limp, damp curls that she was now trying to dry by the fire. She could hear Sid and the Chancellor whispering behind her, but did not bother trying to be part of the conversation. All she could think about was Cecil and Isidore. That had been when Edward and Harley had suddenly appeared in the threshold of the throne room, both panting as if they had run the entire way back from Baron. It had been Harley that cried out in surprise, and it took Rosa a few seconds to realize she wasn't staring at a pair of ghosts or a hallucination. Sid pulled her closer, sensing her confusion.
Cecil told us last night that you were sick,
Edward blurted by way of greeting, and Rosa's eyebrows shot up. The spark of hope had ignited once more.
You spoke to him? Cecil's alive.
Edward and Harley exchanged a look that made Rosa feel as if she had swallowed a pound of lead, promptly snuffing out her hopes once again. She knew that whatever was coming next was not going to be good, and mentally braced herself for the impact.
Yes. But...
The Red Wings. Now that she had been disarmed, Kane had left Rosa to her own devices. She was leaning against the railing of the ship, watching despondently as the Damsayan desert dragged by beneath them. The ship was having trouble reaching full altitude to safely cross the mountains, and Kane had disappeared into the engine room to investigate. It would still only be a matter of time before they reached Farron, and with no hope of securing the crystals, she would have already thrown herself overboard if it hadn't been for Kane's malice-laced promise echoing with each beat of her heart.
I'm going to kill Cecil.
Why? Rosa closed her eyes, cautiously leaning over the side in anticipation of the sickness churning in her gut. Kane, what happened to you while you were away, and why are you suddenly back at the same time as the twin moon? And why are you in a race against Cecil to obtain the crystals? There had not been much time for a reunion when Edward and Harley had returned. Edward had explained that Baron was preparing for an assault to obtain Damsayan's crystal, orchestrated by Cecil himself. Rosa had been too stunned to digest it all at once. She had let Harley take her back to her bedroom while Sid helped Edward and the Chancellor evacuate the rest of the castle's residents to the safety of the rarely used underground dungeons. Sid had stopped by Harley's room one last time, telling Rosa that he was leaving to fix the Enterprise so that he could take Edward and the crystal to safety as soon as possible. Rosa could only remember fragments of the conversation. At one point, she had begged him to let her come, but both Harley and Sid had shut that down fairly quickly, Harley being forced to hold Rosa back as she cried and banged on the door.
Queen Rosa, we need you here,
Harley had said softly, stroking Rosa's hair as she sobbed into her hands.
If something happens to Edward, His Highness, and I, it will be up to you and Sid to protect our crystal. You remember from the castle's rebuilding ceremony 16 years ago how to access the chamber, right? The key is King Edward's ring.
Edward. Harley. I'm sorry I failed you both. Rosa felt her stomach twist violently with one last warning, giving her only seconds to spare before she retched over the side of the ship, choking on the bitter bile that lined her throat as her hair flopped in her eyes. Rubbing the corner of her mouth and pushing her hair away, she stifled another acid-tinged sob. But I know now. Kane would have followed through on his threat if I hadn't shown him where the crystal chamber was. He would have murdered Edward before my eyes, and Damsayan would suffer the same fate as 17 years prior. I just couldn't let that happen again. May the gods forgive me if I made the wrong choice. Suddenly, the airship shook so vigorously that Rosa lost her balance, her legs lifting vertically in the air as she banged against the side of the ship and let out an ear-piercing scream. The scenery before her seemed to crawl in slow motion as she braced herself to plunge headfirst into the depths. She knew that without her magic, there was no way she could survive the fall. She choked on a sob as Cecil's whispered name fell from her lips. She wanted him to be all that she could think about as she died, so that it would feel as painless as possible. She heard a frenzied crash behind her as she tumbled over the railing, and felt a pair of hands embrace her from behind, pulling her back to the deck as effortlessly as one would lift a sack of feathers. The swirling sands of the desert disappeared, and Rosa found herself upright once more, staggering a bit as the blood rushed back down to the rest of her body from her head.
Kane.
Rosa gasped, whirling around to face her savior, a twinge of shame filling her now emptied stomach from being so grateful to see him.
What was that?
Kane paid her no further mind, setting her aside as he stomped to the rear of the ship, raising his hand to shield his eyes from the sun. Rosa scrambled after him, nearly letting out a squeal of delight when she saw the cause of her near demise. The Enterprise was rapidly approaching, Sid in his bushy glory playing navigator at the helm. Rosa watched as he pulled a lever, and another powerful tremble overtook their ship. He was firing warning shots at Kane to force him to land.
Ha ha!
Sid bellowed, his voice exploding from the radio embedded in the ship's rear that burst to life.
Just in time. The Enterprise ain't no spring chicken, but she's still got some kick. Just like me, you know.
Rosa sniffled happily, suddenly having a much renewed appreciation for Sid's intricate knowledge of the Baronian airship fleets. She lowered herself to the radio receiver, pressing the red button that she knew would transmit her voice over the channel he had opened.
Sid. Rosa, is that really you? Are you okay?
Rosa screamed as Kane cut in front of her, jamming the button down and snarling into the microphone.
You just won't die, will you? Not that it matters now. Rosa is already in my hands, so you would better watch real carefully just who you are firing at. I can't be held responsible for what may happen to you if I have to tell Cecil you murdered his wife. Right before I end him myself, of course.
He clicked off the radio, and with a sneer, drove his foot through it, cutting them off from the outside world for good. Rosa swallowed nervously, inching back on her rear as Kane turned to her, grabbing her wrist and lifting her from the floor.
Come along with me, you obviously can't be trusted to keep yourself alive. Let's spend a little quality time together before the final act, shall we? We have so much to catch up on, after all.
End of chapter.